Foreword of Byways to Blessedness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. Foreword. Along the highways of Burma there is placed, at regular distances away from the dust of the road, and under the cool shade of a group of trees, a small wooden building called a rest house, where the weary traveler may rest a while, and allay his thirst and hunger and fatigue by partaking of the food and water which the kindly inhabitants place there as a religious duty. Along the great highway of life there are such resting places, away from the heat of passion and the dust of disappointment. Under the cool and refreshing shade of lowly wisdom are the humble, unimposing rest houses of peace, and the little, almost unnoticed, byways of blessedness, where alone the weary and footsore can find strength and healing. Nor can these byways be ignored without suffering. Along the great road of life, hurrying and eager to reach some elusive goal, presses the multitude, despising the apparently insignificant rest houses of true thought, not heeding the narrow little byways of blessed action, which they regard as unimportant, and hour by hour men are fainting and falling, and numbers that cannot be counted perish of heart hunger, heart thirst, and heart fatigue. But he who will step aside from the passionate press, and will notice and enter the byways which are here presented, his dusty feet shall press the incomparable flowers of blessedness, his eyes be gladdened with their beauty, his mind refreshed with their sweet perfume. Rested and sustained, he will escape the fever and the delirium of life, and strong and happy, he will not fall fainting in the dust, nor perish by the way, but will successfully accomplish his journey. James Allen. End of foreword. Chapter 1 of Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Right Beginnings. All common things, each day's events, that with the hour begin and end, our pleasures and our discontents, are rounds by which we may ascend. We have not wings, we cannot soar, but we have feet to scale and climb. Longfellow. For common life, its wants and ways, would I set forth in beauteous hues. Browning. Life is full of beginnings. They are presented every day and every hour to every person. Most beginnings are small and appear trivial and insignificant, but in reality they are the most important things in life. See how in the material world everything proceeds from small beginnings. The mightiest river is at first a rivulet over which the grasshopper could leap. The great flood commences with a few drops of rain. The sturdy oak, which has endured the storms of 1,000 winters, was once an acorn, and the smoldering match, carelessly dropped, may be the means of devastating a whole town by fire. Consider also how in the spiritual world the greatest things proceed from smallest beginnings. A light fancy may be the inception of a wonderful invention or an immortal work of art. A spoken sentence may turn the tide of history. A pure thought, entertained, may lead to the exercise of a world-wide regenerative power, and a momentary animal impulse may lead to the darkest crime. Have you yet discovered the vast importance of beginnings? Do you really know what is involved in a beginning? Do you know the number of beginnings you are continuously making and realize their full import? If not, come with me for a short time and thoughtfully explore this much ignored byway of blessedness. For blessed it is when wisely resorted to, and much strength and comfort it holds for the understanding mind. A beginning is a cause, and as such it must be followed by an effect, or a train of effects, and the effect will always be the same nature as the cause. The nature of an initial impulse will always determine the body of its results. A beginning also presupposes an ending, a consummation, achievement, or goal. A gate leads to a path, and the path leads to some particular destination, so a beginning leads to results, and results lead to a completion. There are right beginnings and wrong beginnings, which are followed by effects of like nature. You can, by careful thought, avoid wrong beginnings and make right beginnings, and so escape evil results and enjoy good results. There are beginnings over which you have no control and authority. These are without, in the universe, in the world of nature around you, and in other people who have the same liberty as yourself. Do not concern yourself with these beginnings, but direct your energies and attention to those beginnings over which you have complete control and authority, and which bring about the complicated web of results which compose your life. These beginnings are to be found in the realm of your thoughts and actions, in your mental attitude under the variety of circumstances through which you pass, in your conduct day by day, in short, in your life as you make it, which is your world of good or ill. In aiming at the life of blessedness, one of the simplest beginnings to be considered and rightly made is that which we all make every day, namely, the beginning of each day's life. How do you begin each day? At what hour do you rise? How do you commence your duties? In what frame of mind do you enter upon the sacred life of a new day? What answer can you give your heart to these important questions? You will find that much happiness or unhappiness follows upon the right or wrong beginning of the day, and that, when every day is wisely begun, happy and harmonious sequences will mark its course, and life in its totality will not fall short of the ideal blessedness. It is a right and strong beginning to the day to rise at an early hour. Even if your worldly duty does not demand it, it is wise to make of it a duty, and begin the day strongly by shaking off indolence. How are you to develop strength of will and mind and body if you begin every day by yielding to weakness? Self-indulgence is always followed by unhappiness. People who lie abed till a late hour are never bright and cheerful and fresh, but are the prey of irritabilities, depressions, debilities, nervous disorders, abnormal fancies, and all unhappy moods. This is the heavy price which they pay for their daily indolence. Yet, so blinding is the pandering to self that the drunkard who takes his daily dram in the belief that it is bracing up the nerves, which it is all the time shattering, so the lie abed is convinced that long hours of ease are necessary for him as a possible remedy for those very moods and weaknesses and disorders of which his indolence is the cause. Men and women are totally unaware of the great losses which they entail by this common indolence: loss of strength of both mind and body, loss of prosperity, loss of knowledge, and loss of happiness. Begin the day then by rising early. If you have no object in doing so, never mind, get up and go out for a gentle walk among the beauties of nature, and you will experience a buoyancy, a freshness, and a delight, not to say a peace of mind, which will amply reward you for your effort. One good effort is followed by another, and when a man begins the day by rising early, even though with no other purpose in view, he will find that the silent early hour is conducive to clearness of mind and calmness of thought, and that his early morning walk is enabling him to become a consecutive thinker, and so to see life and its problems, as well as himself and his affairs, in a clearer light, and so in time he will rise early with the express purpose of preparing and harmonizing his mind to meet any and every difficulty with wisdom and calm strength. There is, indeed, a spiritual influence in the early morning hour, a divine silence, an inexpressible repose, and he who, purposeful and strong, throws off the mantle of ease, and climbs the hills to greet the morning sun, will thereby climb no inconsiderable distance up the hills of blessedness and truth. The right beginning of the day will be followed by cheerfulness at the morning meal, permeating the household with a sunny influence, and the tasks and duties of the day will be undertaken in a strong and confident spirit, and the whole day will be well lived. Then there is a sense in which every day must be regarded as the beginning of new life, in which one can think, act, and live newly and in a wiser and better spirit. Every day is a fresh beginning. Every morn is the world made new. You who are weary of sorrow and sinning, here is a beautiful hope for you, a hope for me and a hope for you. Do not dwell upon the sins and mistakes of yesterday so exclusively as to have no energy and mind left for living rightly today, and do not think that the sins of yesterday can prevent you from living purely today. Begin today aright, and aided by the accumulated experiences of all your past days, live it better than any of your previous days. But you cannot possibly live it better unless you begin it better. The character of the whole day depends upon the way it begins. Another beginning which is of great importance is the beginning of any particular and responsible undertaking. How does a man begin the building of a house? He first secures a plan of the proposed edifice, and then proceeds to build according to the plan, scrupulously following it in every detail, beginning with the foundation. Should he neglect the beginning, namely the obtaining of a mathematical plan, his labor would be wasted, and his building, should it reach completion without tumbling to pieces, would be insecure and worthless. The same law holds good in any important work. The right beginning and first essential is a definite mental plan on which to build. Nature will have no slipshod work, no slovenliness, and she annihilates confusion, or rather, confusion is in itself annihilation. Order, purpose eternally and universally prevail, and he who in his operations ignores these mathematical elements at once deprives himself of sustainability, completeness, and success. Life without a plan, as useless as the moment it began, serves merely as a soil for discontent, to thrive in encumbrance, ere half spent. Let a man start in business without having in his mind a perfectly formed plan to systematically pursue, and he will be incoherent in his efforts and will fail in his business operations. The laws which must be observed in the building of a house also operate in the building up of a business. A definite plan is followed by coherent effort, and coherent effort is followed by well-knit and orderly results, to wit, completeness, perfection, success, happiness. But not only mechanical and commercial enterprise, all undertakings, of whatsoever nature, come under this law. The author's book, the artist's picture, the orator's speech, the reformer's work, the inventor's machine, the general's campaign, are all carefully planned in the mind before the attempt to actualize them is commenced, and in accordance with the unity, solidarity, and perfection of the original mental plan will be the actual and ultimate success of the undertaking. Successful men, influential men, good men, are those who, amongst other things, have learned the value and utilize the power which lies in those obscure beginnings, which the foolish man passes by as insignificant. But the most important beginning of all, that upon which affliction or blessedness inevitably depends, yet is most neglected and least understood, is the inception of a thought, in the hidden but casual region of the mind. Your whole life is a series of effects having their cause in thought, in your own thought. All conduct is made and melded by thought. All deeds, good or bad, are thoughts made visible. A seed put into the ground is the beginning of a plant or tree. The seed germinates. the plant or tree comes forth into the light and evolves. A thought put into the mind is the beginning of a line of conduct. The thought first sends down its roots into the mind, and then pushes forth into the light in the forms of action or conduct, which evolve into character and destiny. Hateful, angry, envious, and impure thoughts are wrong beginnings, which lead to painful results. Loving, gentle, kind, unselfish, and pure thoughts are right beginnings, which lead to blissful results. This is so simple, so plain, so absolutely true, and yet how neglected, how evaded, and how little understood. The gardener who most carefully studies how, when, and where to put his seeds obtains the best results and gains the greater horticulture knowledge. The best crops gladden the soul of him who makes the best beginning. The man who patiently studies how to put into his mind the seeds of strong, wholesome, and charitable thoughts will obtain the best results in life and will gain greater knowledge of truth. The greatest blessedness comes to him who infuses into his mind the purest and noblest thoughts. None but right acts can follow right thoughts. None but a right life can follow right acts, and by living a right life all blessedness is achieved. He who considers the nature and import of his thoughts, who strives daily to eliminate bad thoughts and supplant them with good, comes at last to see that thoughts are the beginnings of results which affect every fiber of his being, which potently influence every event and circumstance of his life. And when he thus sees, he thinks only right thoughts, chooses to make only those mental beginnings which lead to peace and blessedness. Wrong thoughts are painful in their inception, painful in their growth, and painful in their fruitage. Right thoughts are blissful in their inception, blissful in their growth, and blissful in their fruitage. Many are the right beginnings which a man must discover and adopt on his way to wisdom. But that which is first and last, most important and all-embracing, which is the source and fountain of all abiding happiness, is the right beginning of the mental operations. This implies the steady development of self-control, willpower, steadfastness, strength, purity, gentleness, insight, and comprehension. It leads to the perfecting of life, for he who thinks perfectly has abolished all unhappiness. Every moment of his life is peaceful. His years are rounded with bliss. He has attained to the complete and perfect blessedness. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Small Tasks and Duties. Wrapped in our nearest duty is the key, which shall unlock for us the heavenly gate. Unveiled, the heavenly vision he shall see, as pain and bliss, who cometh not too early or too late. Like the star that shines afar, without haste and without rest, let each man wheel with steady sway round the task that rules the day, and do his best. Goethe. As pain and bliss inevitably follow on wrong and right beginnings, so unhappiness and blessedness are inseparably bound up with small tasks and duties. Not that a duty has any power of itself to bestow happiness or the reverse. This is contained in the attitude of the mind which is assumed towards the duty, and everything depends upon the way in which it is approached and done. Not only great happiness, but great power arises from doing little things unselfishly, wisely, and perfectly, for life in its totality is made up of little things. Wisdom inheres in the common details of everyday existence, and when the parts are made perfect, the whole will be without blemish. Everything in the universe is made up of little things, and the perfection of the great is based upon the perfection of the small. If any detail of the universe were imperfect, the whole would be imperfect. if any particle were omitted, the aggregate would cease to be. Without a grain of dust there could be no world, and the world is perfect because the grain of dust is perfect. Neglect of the small is confusion of the great. The snowflake is as perfect as the star. The dewdrop is as symmetrical as the planet. The microbe is not less mathematically proportioned than the man. By laying stone upon stone, plumbing and fitting each with perfect adjustment, the temple at last stands forth in all its architectural beauty. The small precedes the great. The small is not merely the apologetic attendant of the great, it is its master and informing genius. Vain men are ambitious to be great, and look about to do some great thing, ignoring and despising the little tasks which call for immediate attention, and in doing in which there is no vain glory, regarding such trivialities as beneath the notice of great men. The fool lacks knowledge because he lacks humility, and inflated with the thought of self-importance, he aims at impossible things. The great man has become such by the scrupulous and unselfish attention which he has given to small duties. He has become wise and powerful by sacrificing ambition and pride in the doing of those necessary things which evoke no applause and promise no reward. He never sought greatness. He sought faithfulness, unselfishness, integrity, truth, and in finding these in the common round of small tasks and duties, he unconsciously ascended to the level of greatness. The great man knows the vast value that inheres in moments, words, greetings, meals, apparel, correspondence, rest, work, detached efforts, fleeting obligations, in the 1,001 little things which press upon him for attention, briefly, in the common details of life. He sees everything as divinely apportioned, needing only the application of dispassionate thought and action on his part to render life blessed and perfect. He neglects nothing, does not hurry, seeks to escape nothing but error and folly, attends to every duty as it is presented to him, and does not postpone and regret. By giving himself unreservedly to his nearest duty, forgetting alike pleasure and pain, he attains to that combined childlike simplicity and unconscious power which is greatness. The advice of Confucius to his disciples, "Eat at your own table as you would at the table of a king," emphasizes the immeasurable importance of little things, as also does that aphorism of another great teacher, Buddha, "If anything is to be done, let a man do it. Let him attack it vigorously. To neglect small tasks, or to execute them in a perfunctory or slovenly manner, is a mark of weakness and folly." The giving of one's entire and unselfish attention to every duty in its proper place evolves, by a natural growth, higher and even higher combinations of duties, because it evolves power and develops talent, genius, goodness, character. A man ascends into greatness as naturally and unconsciously as the plant evolves into a flower, and in the same manner, by fitting, with unabated energy and diligence, every effort and detail in its proper place, thus harmonizing his life and character without friction or waste of power. Of the almost innumerable recipes for the development of will power and concentration which are now scattered abroad, one looks almost in vain for any wholesome hint applicable to vital experience. Breathings, postures, visualings, occult methods are practices as delusive as they are artificial and remote from all that is real and essential in life, while the true path, the path of duty, of earnest and undivided application to one's daily task, along with alone will-power and concentration of thought, can be wholesomely and normally developed, remains unknown, untrodden, unexplored, even by the elect. All unnatural forcing and straining in order to gain power should be abandoned. There is no way from childhood to manhood but by growth, nor is there any other way from folly to wisdom, from ignorance to knowledge, from weakness to strength. A man must learn how to grow little by little and day after day by adding thought to thought, effort to effort, deed to deed. It is true the fakir gains some sort of power by his long persistence in postures and mortifications, but it is a power which is bought at a heavy price, and that price is an equal loss of strength in another direction. He is never a strong, useful character, but a mere fantastic specialist in some psychological trick. He is not a developed man, he is a maimed man. True willpower consists in overcoming the irritabilities, follies, rash impulses, and moral lapses which accompany the daily life of the individual, and which are apt to manifest themselves on every slight provocation, and in developing calmness, self-possession, and dispassionate action in the press and heat of worldly duties, and in the midst of the passionate and unbalanced throng. Anything short of this is not true power, and this can only be developed along the normal pathway of steady growth, in executing ever more and more masterfully, unselfishly, and perfectly the daily round of legitimate tasks and pressing obligations. The master is not he whose psychological accomplishments, rounded by mystery and wonder, leave him at unguarded moments the prey of irritability, of regret, of peevishness, or other petty folly or vice, but he whose mastery is manifested in fortitude, non-resentment, steadfastness, calmness, and infinite patience. The true master is master of himself. Anything other than this is not mastery, but delusion. The man who sets his whole mind on the doing of each task as it is presented, who puts into it energy and intelligence, shutting all else out from his mind, and striving to do that one thing, no matter how small, completely and perfectly, detaching himself from all reward in his task, that man will every day be acquiring greater command over his mind, and will, by ever ascending degrees, become at last a man of power, a master. Put yourself unreservedly into your present task, and so work, act, live, that you shall leave each task a finished piece of labor. This is the very true way to the acquisition of willpower, concentration of thought, and conservation of energy. Look not about for magical formulas, for strained and artificial methods. Every resource is already with you and within you. You have but to learn how wisely to apply yourself in that place which you now occupy. Until this is done, those other and higher places which are waiting for you cannot be taken possession of, cannot be reached. There is no way to strengthen wisdom but by acting strongly and wisely in the present moment, and each present moment reveals its task. The great man, the wise man, does small things greatly, regarding nothing as trivial that is necessary. The weak man, the foolish man, does small things carelessly and meaningly, hankering the while after some greater work for which, in his neglect and inability in small matters, he is ceaselessly advertising his incapacity. The man who least governs himself is always more ambitious to govern others and assume important responsibilities. Whoso neglects a thing which he suspects he ought to do because it seems too small a thing is deceiving himself. It is not too little, but too great for him that he doth it not. And just as the strong doing of small tasks leads to greater strength, so the doing of those tasks weakly leads to greater weakness. What a man is in his fractional duties, that he is in the aggregate of his character. Weakness is as great a source of suffering as sin, and there can be no true blessedness until some measure of strength of character is evolved. The weak man becomes strong by attaching value to little things and doing them accordingly. The strong man becomes weak by falling into looseness and neglect concerning small things, thereby forfeiting his simple wisdom and squandering his energy. Herein we see the beneficent operation of that law of growth, which is expressed in the little understood words, To him that hath shall be given, and from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. Man instantly gains or loses by every thought he thinks, every word he says, every act he does, and every work to which he puts heart and hand. His character from moment to moment is a graduating quantity, to or from which some measure of good is added or subtracted during every moment, and the gain or loss is involved, even to absoluteness, in each thought, word, and deed, as these follow each other in rapid sequence. He who masters the small becomes the rightful possessor of the great. He who is mastered by the small can achieve no superlative victory. Life is a kind of cooperative trust, in which the whole is the nature of and dependent upon the unit. A successful business, a perfect machine, a glorious temple, or a beautiful character is evolved from the perfect adjustment of a multiplicity of parts. The foolish man thinks that little faults, little indulgences, little sins are of no consequence. He persuades himself that so long as he does not commit flagrant immoralities, he is virtuous and even holy, but he is thereby deprived of virtue and holiness, and the world knows him accordingly. It does not reverence, adore, and love him. It passes him by. He is reckoned of no account. His influence is destroyed. The efforts of such a man to make the world virtuous, his exhortations to his fellow men to abandon great vices, are empty of substance and barren of fruitage. The insignificance which he attaches to his small vices permeates his whole character, and is the measure of his manhood. He is regarded as an insignificant man. The levity with which he commits his errors and publishes his weaknesses comes back to him in the form of neglect and loss of influence and respect. He is not sought after, for who will seek to be taught of folly? His work does not prosper, for who will lean up a reed? His words fall on deaf ears, for they are void of practice, wisdom, and experience, and who will go after an echo? The wise man, or he who is becoming wise, sees the danger which lurks in those common personal faults which men mostly commit thoughtlessly and with impunity. He also sees the salvation which inheres in the abandonment of those faults, as well as in the practice of virtuous thoughts and acts, which the majority disregard as unimportant, and in those quiet but momentous daily quests over self, which are hidden from others' eyes. He who regards his molest delinquencies as of the gravest nature becomes a saint. He sees the far-reaching influence, good or bad, which extends from his every thought and act, and how he himself is made or unmade by the soundness or unsoundness of those innumerable details of conduct which combine to form his character and life, and so he watches, guards, purifies, and protects himself little by little and step by step. As the ocean is composed of drops, the earth of grains, and the stars of points of light, so is life composed of thoughts and acts. Without these, life would not be. Every man's life, therefore, is what his apparently detached thoughts and acts make it. Their combination is himself. As the year consists of a given number of sequential moments, so a man's character and life consists of a given number of sequential thoughts and deeds, and the finished whole will bear the impress of the parts. All sorts of things and weather must be taken in together to make up a year and a sphere. Little kindnesses, generosities, and sacrifices make up a kind and generous character. Little renunciations, endurances, and victories over self make up a strong and noble character. The truly honest man is honest in the minutest details of his life. The noble man is noble in every little thing he says and does. It is a fatal delusion with men to think that life is detached from the momentary thought and act, and not to understand that the passing thought and deed is the foundation and substance of life. When this is fully understood, all things are seen as sacred, and every act becomes religious. Truth is wrapped up in infinitesimal details. Thoroughness is genius. Possessions vanish and opinions change, and passions hold a fluctuating seat. But by the storms of circumstance unshaken, and subject neither to eclipse nor wane, duty exists. You do not live your life in the mass, you live it in the fragments, and from these the mass emerges. You can will to live each fragment nobly if you choose, and this being done, there can be no particles of baseness in the finished whole. The saying, "Take care of the pence, and the pounds will take care of themselves," is seen to be more than worldly wise when applied spiritually, for to take care of the present passing act, knowing that by doing the total sum and amount of life and character will be safely preserved, is to be divinely wise. Do not long to do great and laudable things. These will do themselves if you do your present task nobly. Do not chafe at the restrictions and limitations of your present duty, but be nobly unselfish in the doing of it, putting aside discontent, listlessness, and the foolish contemplation of great deeds which lie beyond you, and lo, already the greatness for which you sighed begins to appear. There is no weakness like peevishness. Aspire to the attainment of inward nobility, not outward glory, and begin to attain it where you are now. The irksome and sting which you feel to be in your task are in your mind only. Alter your attitude of mind towards it, and at once the crooked path is made straight, the unhappiness is turned to joy. See that your every fleeting moment is strong, pure, and purposeful. Put earnestness and unselfishness into every passing task and duty. Make your every thought, word, and deed sweet and true, thus learning, by practice and experience, the inestimable value of the small things of life. You will gather, little by little, abundant and enduring blessedness. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. Chapter 3. Transcending Difficulties and Perplexities. Man who man would be must rule the empire of himself. In it must be supreme, establishing his throne on vanquished will, quelling the anarchy of hopes and fears, being himself alone. Shelley. Have you missed your aim? Well, the mark is still shining. Did you faint in the race? Well, take breath for the next. Ella Wheeler Wilcox. To suggest that any degree of blessedness may be extracted from difficulties and perplexities will doubtless appear absurd to many, but truth is ever paradoxical, and the curses of the foolish are the blessings of the wise. Difficulties arise in ignorance and weakness, and they call for the attainment of knowledge and the acquisition of strength. As understanding is acquired by right living, difficulties become fewer, and perplexities gradually fade away, like the perishable mists which they are. Your difficulty is not contained primarily in the situation which gave rise to it, but in the mental state with which you regard that situation, and which you bring to bear upon it. That which is difficult to a child presents no difficulty to the matured mind of the man, and that which to the mind of an unintelligent man is surrounded with perplexity would afford no ground for perplexity to an intelligent man. To the untutored and undeveloped mind of the child how great, and apparently insurmountable, appear the difficulties which are involved in the learning of some simple lesson. How many anxious and laborious hours and days, or even months, its solution costs, and frequently how many tears are shed in hopeless contemplation of the unmastered, and apparently insurmountable, wall of difficulty. Yet the difficulty is in the ignorance of the child only, and its conquest and solution is absolutely necessary for the development of intelligence and for the ultimate welfare, happiness, and usefulness of the child. Even so it is with difficulties of life with which older children are confronted, and which it is imperative, for their own growth and development, that they should solve and surmount, and each difficulty solved means so much more experience gained, so much more insight and wisdom acquired. It means a valuable lesson learned, with the added gladness and freedom of a task successfully accomplished. What is the real nature of a difficulty? Is it not a situation which is not fully grasped and understood in all its bearings? As such, it calls for the development and exercise of a deeper insight and broader intelligence than has hitherto been exercised. It is an urgent necessity calling forth unused energy, and demanding the expression and employment of latent power in hidden resources. It is therefore a good angel, albeit disguised, a friend, a teacher, and when calmly listened to and rightly understood, leads to larger blessedness and higher wisdom. Without difficulties there could be no progress, no unfoldment, no evolution. Universal stagnation would prevail, and humanity would perish of ennui. Let a man rejoice when he is confronted with obstacles, for it means that he has reached the end of some particular line of indifference or folly, and is now called upon to summon up all his energy and intelligence in order to extricate himself, and to find a better way, that the powers within him are crying out for greater freedom, for enlarged exercise and scope. No situation can be difficult of itself. It is the lack of insight into its intricacies, and the want of wisdom in dealing with it, which give rise to the difficulty. Immeasurable, therefore, is the gain of a difficulty transcended. Difficulties do not spring into existence arbitrarily and accidentally. They have their causes, and they are called forth by the law of evolution itself, by the growing necessities of the man's being. Herein resides their blessedness. There are ways of conduct which end inevitably in complications and perplexities, and there are ways of conduct which lead, just as inevitably, out of troublesome complexities. Howsoever tightly a man may have bound himself round, he can always unbind himself. Into whatsoever morasses of trouble and trackless wastes of perplexity he may have ignorantly wandered, he can always find his way out again. He can always recover the lost highway of uninvolved simplicity, which leads, straight and clear, to the sunny city of wise and blessed action. But he will never do this by sitting down and weeping in despair, nor by complaining and worrying and aimlessly wishing he were differently situated. His dilemma calls for alertness, logical thought, and calm calculation. His position requires that he shall strongly command himself, that he shall think and search, and rouse himself to strenuous and unremitting exertion in order to regain himself. Worry and anxiety only serve to heighten the gloom and exaggerate the magnitude of the difficulty. If he will but quietly take himself to task, and retrace, in thought, the more or less intricate way by which he has come to his present position, he will soon perceive where he made mistakes, will discover those places where he took a false turn, and where a little more thoughtfulness, judgment, economy, or self-denial would have saved him. He will see how, step by step, he has involved himself, and how a riper judgment and clearer wisdom would have enabled him to take an altogether different and truer course. Having proceeded thus far, and extracted from his past conduct this priceless grain of golden wisdom, his difficulty will have already assumed less impregnable proportions, and he will then be able to bring to bear upon it the searchlight of dispassionate thought, to thoroughly anatomize it, to comprehend it in all its details, and to perceive the relation with which those details bear to the motive source of action and conduct within himself. This being done, the difficulty will have ceased, for the straight way out of it will plainly appear, and the man will have thus learned, for all time, his lesson. will have gained an idea of wisdom and a measure of blessedness of which he can never again be deprived. Just as there are ways of ignorance, selfishness, folly, and blindness which end in confusion and perplexity, so there are ways of knowledge, self-denial, wisdom, and insight which lead to pleasant and peaceful consummations. He who knows this will meet difficulties in a courageous spirit, and in overcoming them will evolve truth out of error, bliss out of pain, and peace out of perturbation. No man can be confronted with a difficulty which he has not the strength to meet and subdue. Worry is not merely useless, it is a folly, for it defeats that power and intelligence which is otherwise equal to the task. Every difficulty can be overcome if rightly dealt with. Anxiety is therefore unnecessary. The task which cannot be overcome ceases to be a difficulty and become an impossibility, and anxiety is still unnecessary, for there is only one way of dealing with an impossibility, namely to submit to it. The inevitable is the best. Heartily know where half gods go, the gods arrive. And just as domestic, social, and economic difficulties are born of ignorance and lead to riper knowledge, so every religious doubt, every mental perplexity, every heart-beclouding shadow presages greater spiritual gain, is prophetic of a brighter dawn of intelligence for him on whom it falls. It is a great day in the life of a man, though at the time he knows it not, when bewildering perplexities concerning the mystery of life take possession of his mind, for it signifies that his era of dead indifference, of animal sloth, of mere vegetative happiness has come to an end, and that henceforth he is to live as an inspiring, self-evolving being. No longer a mere human animal, he will now begin to live as a man, exerting all his mental energies to the solution of life's problems, to the answering of those haunting perplexities which are the sentinels of truth, and which stand at the gate and threshold of the temple of wisdom. He it is who, when great trials come, nor seeks nor shuns them, but doth calmly stay. Nor will he ever rest again in selfless ease and listless ignorance, nor sleekly sate himself upon the swine's husks of fleshly pleasures, nor find a hiding place from the ceaseless whisperings of his heart's dark and indefinable interrogatories. The divine within him has awakened. A sleeping God is shaking off the incoherent visions of the night, never again to slumber, never again to rest, until his eyes rest upon the full, broad day of truth. It is impossible for such a man to hush, for any length of time, the call to his higher purposes and achievements, which are aroused within him, for the awakened faculties of his being will ceaselessly urge him on to the unraveling of his perplexities. For him there is no peace in sin, no more rest in error, no final refuge, but in wisdom. Great will be the blessedness of such a man, when conscious of the ignorance of which his doubts and perplexities are born, and acknowledging and understanding that ignorance, not striving to hide himself from it, he earnestly applies himself to its removal, seeks unremittingly, day after day, for that pathway of light, which shall enable him to dispel all dark shadows, dissolve all his doubts, and find the solution to all his pressing problems. And as a child is glad when it has mastered a lesson long toiled over, just so a man's heart becomes light and free when he has satisfactorily met some worldly difficulty. Even so, but to a far greater degree, is the heart of a man rendered joyous and peaceful when some vital and eternal question, which has been long brooded over and grappled with, is at last completely answered, and its darkness is forever dispelled. Do not regard your difficulties and perplexities as portentous of ill. By doing so you will make them ill, but regard them as prophetic of good, which indeed they are. Do not persuade yourself that you can evade them. You cannot. Do not try to run from them. This is impossible, for wherever you go they will still be there with you. But meet them calmly and bravely, confront them with all the dispassion and dignity which you can command. Weigh up their proportions, analyze them, grasp their details, measure their strength, understand them, attack them, and finally vanquish them. Thus will you develop strength and intelligence. Thus will you enter into one of those byways of blessedness which are hidden from the superficial gaze. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 4. Burden Dropping. This to me is life, that if life be a burden I will join, to make it but the burden of a song. Bailey. Have you heard that it was good to gain the day? I also say it is good to fall. Battles are lost in the same spirit in which they are won. Walt Whitman. We hear and read much about burden bearing, but of the better way of burden dropping very little is heard or known. Yet why should you go about with an oppressive weight at your heart when you might relieve yourself of it and move amongst your fellows heart-free and cheerful? No man carries a burden upon his back except to necessarily transfer something from one place to another. He does not saddle his shoulders with a perpetual burden and then regard himself as a martyr for his pains. And why should you impose upon your mind a useless burden, and then add to its weight the miseries of self-condolence and self-pity? Why not abandon both your load and your misery, and thus add to the gladness of the world, by first making yourself glad? No reason can justify, and no logic can support, the ceaseless carrying of a grievous load. As in things material, a load is only undertaken as a necessary means of transference, and is never a source of sorrow, so in things spiritual, a burden should only be taken up as a means towards some good and necessary end, which, when attained, the burden is put aside, and the carrying of such a burden, far from being a source of grief, would be a cause for rejoicing. We say that bodily mortifications, which some religious ascetics inflict upon themselves, are unnecessary and vain, and are the mental mortifications, which so many people inflict upon themselves, less unnecessary and vain? Where is the burden which should cause unhappiness and sorrow? It does not exist. If a thing is to be done, let it be done cheerfully, and not with the inward groanings and lamentations. It is of the highest wisdom to embrace necessity as a friend and guide. It is of the greatest folly to scowl upon necessity as an enemy, and to wish or try to overcome or avoid her. We meet our own at every turn, and duties only become oppressive loads when we refuse to recognize and embrace them. He who does any necessary thing in a niggardly and complaining spirit, hunting the while after unnecessary pleasures, lashes himself with the scorpions of misery and disappointment, and imposes upon himself a doubly weighted burden of weariness and unrest, under which he incessantly groans. Wake thou, O self, to better things, to yonder heights uplift thy wings. Take up the psalm of life anew, sing the good, sing of the true, sing of full victory over wrong. Make thou a richer, sweeter song. Out of thy doubting, care, and pain, weave thou a joyous, glad refrain. Out of thy thorns a crown weave thou, of rare rejoicing. Sing thou now. I will give my cheerful, unselfish, and undivided attention to the doing of all those things which enter into my compact with life, and though I walk under colossal responsibilities, I shall be unconscious of any troublesome weight or grievous burden. You may say a certain thing, a duty, a companionship, or a social obligation, troubles you, is burdensome, and you resign yourself to oppression with the thought, I have entered into this, and will go through it, but it is heavy and grievous work. But is the thing really burdensome, Or is it your selfishness that is oppressing you? I tell you that the very thing with which you regard as so imprisoning a restriction is the first gateway to your emancipation. That work which you regard as a perpetual curse contains for you the actual blessedness which you vainly persuade yourself lies in another and unapproachable direction. All things are mirrors in which you see yourself reflected, and the gloom which you perceive in your work is but a reflection of that mental state which you bring to it. Bring a right and unselfish state of heart to the thing, and lo, it is at once transformed and becomes a means of strength and blessedness, reflecting back that which you have brought to it. If you bring a scowling face to your looking-glass, will you complain of the glass, that it glowers upon you with a deformed visage, or will you put your face right, and so get back from the reflector a more pleasing countenance? It is right and necessary that a thing should be done when the doing of it is good, and can only become burdensome in wishing not to do it. The selfish wish makes the thing appear evil. It is neither right nor necessary that a thing should be done then the doing of it in order to gain some coveted pleasure is folly, which can only lead to burdensome issues. The duty which you shirk is your most reproving angel. The pleasure which you race after is your most flattering enemy. Foolish man, when will you turn around and be wise? It is the beneficence of the universe that is everywhere and at all times, urging its creatures to wisdom as it demands coherence of its atoms. The folly and selfishness entails suffering in ever-increasing degrees of intensity is preservative and good, for agony is the enemy of apathy and the herald of wisdom. What is painful? What is grievous? What is burdensome? Passion is painful. Folly is grievous. Selfishness is burdensome. It is the dark idolatry of self, which when our thoughts and actions once are done, demands that man should weep and bleed and groan. Eliminate passion, folly, and selfishness from your mind and conduct, and you will eliminate suffering from your life. Burden dropping consists in abandoning the inward selfishness and putting pure love in its place. Go to your task with love in your heart, and you will go to it light-hearted and cheerful. The mind, through ignorance, creates its own burdens and inflicts its own punishments. No one is doomed to carry any load. Sorrow is not arbitrarily imposed. These things are self-made. Reason is the rightful monarch of the mind, and anarchy reigns in his spiritual kingdom when his throne is usurped by passion. When love of pleasure is the fore, heaviness and anguish compose the rear. You are free to choose. Even if you are bound by passion and feel helpless, you have bound yourself and are not helpless. Where you have bound you can unbind. You have come to your present state by degrees, and you can recover yourself by degrees, can reinstate reason and dethrone passion. The time to avoid evil is before pleasure is embraced, but once embraced, its train of consequences should teach you wisdom. The time to decide is before responsibilities are adopted, but once adopted, all selfish considerations, with their attendant grumblings, whinings, and complainings, should be religiously excluded from the heart. Responsibilities lose their weight when carried lovingly and wisely. What heavy burden is a man weighted with, which is not made heavier and more unendurable by weak thoughts of selfish desires? If your circumstances are trying, it is because you need them and can evolve the strength to meet them. They are trying because there is some weak spot within you, and they will continue to be trying until that spot is eradicated. Be glad that you have the opportunity of becoming stronger and wiser. No circumstances can be trying to wisdom. Nothing can weary love. Stop brooding over your own trying circumstances and contemplate the lives of some of those about you. Here is a woman with a large family who has to make ends meet on £1 a week. She performs all her domestic duties, down to the washing, finds time to attend on sick neighbors, and manages to keep entirely out of the two common quagmires, debt, and despondency. She is cheerful from morning to night, and never complains of her trying circumstances. She is perennially cheerful because she is unselfish. She is happy in the thought that she is the means of happiness to others. Were she to brood upon the holidays, the pretty baubles, the lazy hours of which she is deprived, the plays she cannot see, the music she cannot hear, the books she cannot read, the parties she cannot attend, the good she might do, the friendships she is debarred from forming, of the many pleasures which might only be hers if the circumstances were more favourable. If she brooded, thus what a miserable creature she would be, how unbearably laborious her work would become, how every little domestic duty would hang like a millstone about her neck, dragging her down to the grave, which, unless she altered her state of mind, she would quickly reach, killed by selfishness. But in not living in the vain desires for herself, she is relieved of all burdens, and is happy. Cheerfulness and unselfishness are sworn friends. Love knows no heavy toil. Here is another woman, with a private income which is much more sufficient, combined with leisure and luxury, yet she is called upon to forfeit a portion of her time, pleasure, and money, to discharge some obligation which she wishes to be rid of, and which should be to her work a loving service, or fostering in her heart some ungratified desire. She is perpetually discontented and unhappy, and complains of trying circumstances. Discontent and selfishness are inseparable companions. Self-love knows no joyful labor. Of the two sets of circumstances above depicted, and life is crowded with such contrasted instances, which are the trying conditions? Is it not true that neither of them are trying, and that both are blessed or unblessed, in accordance with the measure of love or selfishness which is infused into them? Is it not the root of the whole matter in the mind of the individual, and not the circumstance? When a man who has recently taken up the study of some branch of theology, religion, or occultism says, "If I had not burdened myself with a wife and family, I could have done a great work, and had I known years ago what I know now, I never would have married," I know that that man has not yet found the commonest and broadest way of wisdom, for there is no greater folly than regret, and he is incapable of the great work which he is so ambitious to perform. If a man has such a deep love for his fellow men that he is anxious to do a great work for humanity, he will manifest that surpassing love always, and in the place where he now is. His home will be filled with it, and the beauty and sweetness and peace of his unselfish love will follow wherever he goes, making happy those about him, and transmuting all things into good. The love that goes abroad to air itself, and is undiscoverable at home, is not love, it is vanity. Have I not seen, O pitiful sight, the cheerless home and neglected children of the misguided missioner and religionist? It is on such self-delusion as this that self-pity and self-martyrdom ever wait, and its self-inflicted misery is regarded by the deluded one as holy and religious burden which he or she is called upon to bear. Only a great man can do great work, and he will be great wherever he is, and will do his noble work under whatsoever circumstances he may find himself, when he has unfolded and revealed that work. Thou who art so anxious to work for humanity, to help thy fellow men, begin that work at home. Help thyself, thy neighbor, thy wife, thy child. Do not be deluded until thou doest, with utmost faithfulness, the nearer and the lesser thou canst not do, the farther and greater. If a man has lived many years of his life in lust and selfish pleasure, it is the order of things that his accumulated errors should weigh at last heavily upon him, as until they are thus brought home to him, he will not abandon them. He will not exert himself to find a better life, but whilst he regards his self-made, self-imposed burdens as holy crosses imposed upon him by the Supreme, or as marks of spiritual virtue, or as loads with fate, circumstances, or other people have heaped undeservedly and unjustly upon him. He is but lengthening out his folly, increasing the weight of his burdens, and multiplying his pains and sorrows. Only when such a man wakes up to the truth that his burdens are of his own making, that they are the accumulated effects of his own acts, will he cease from unmanly self-pity and find the better way of burden-dropping. Only when he opens his eyes to see that every thought and act is another brick, another stone, built into the temple of his life, will he develop the insight which will enable him to recognize his own unstable handiwork, the unflinching manliness to acknowledge it, and the courage to build more nobly and enduringly. Painful burdens are necessary, but only so long as we lack love and wisdom. The temple of blessedness lies beyond the outer courts of suffering and humiliation, and to reach it the pilgrim must pass through the outer courts. For a time he will linger in the outer, but only so long as, through his own imperfect understanding, he mistakes it for the inner. While he pities himself and confounds suffering with holiness, he will remain in suffering. But when casting off the last unholy rag of self-pity, he perceives that suffering is a means and not an end, that it is a state self-originated and self-propagated, then converted and right-minded, he will rapidly pass through the outer courts and reach the inner abode of peace. Suffering does not originate in the perfect, but in the imperfect. It does not mark the complete, but the incomplete. It can, therefore, be transcended. Its self-born cause can be found, investigated, comprehended, and forever removed. It is true, therefore, that we must pass through agony to rest, through loneliness to peace. But let the sufferer not forget it is a passing through, that the agony is a gateway and not a habitation, that the loneliness is a pathway and not a destination, and that a little farther on he will come to the painless and blissful repose. Little by little is a burden accumulated, imperceptibly and by degrees is its weight increased. A thoughtless impulse, a gross self-indulgence, a blind passion yielded to and gratified again and again, an impure thought fostered, a cruel word uttered, a foolish thing done time after time, and at last the gathered weight of many follies becomes oppressive. At first and for a time the weight is not felt, but it is being added to day after day, and the time comes when the accumulated burden is felt in all its galling weight, when the bitter fruits of selfishness are gathered, and the heart is troubled with the weariness of life. When this period arrives, let the sufferer look to himself. Let him search for the blessed way of burden-dropping, finding which he will find wisdom to live better, purity to live sweeter, love to live nobler, will find, in the reversal of that conduct by which his burdens were accumulated, light-hearted nights and days, cheerful action, and unclouded joy. Come out of the world, come above it, up over its crosses and graves. Though the green earth is fair, and I love it, we must love it as masters, not slaves. Come up where the dust never rises, but only the perfume of flowers, and your life shall be glad with surprises of beautiful hours. End of chapter 4. Recording by Andrea Fiore.